I want to give an introduction to a subject that has been very dominant over the last probably 15 years, almost 20 years. It's the subject of self-esteem. The interesting thing is that if you go back into the 1980s, even into the early 1990s, the term virtually is non-existent. If you do research on it, you find that this is a term that goes back quite a long way. A century before, the concept of self-esteem had been discussed by some psychologists. But overall, it was not in the public domain. I picked up a book in the airport in London once, and I've never been able to retrace it, and I'm very frustrated because I can't find the book. But it was a book where a journalist had decided to trace something like 120 different journals and newspapers to find out how often the term self-esteem was mentioned. And he found that if you went back, as I said, into the 80s and 90s, it virtually was non-existent. But within a few years, it went from being really quite an uncommon sort of term in the English language to becoming extremely dominant at all sorts of level of discourse about human health, about even sports, about teenage psychology. In all those areas, suddenly this term self-esteem became a major term. And I have just recently, fortunately, after years of struggle, have managed to get the attention of a publisher who is about to publish a book which is entitled Beyond the Myth of Self-Esteem. When I use the term myth, I mean that there are certain kinds of images and concepts that occur in a culture that become very powerful in forming the general consciousness of that culture. So I feel I should do a number of presentations on this, but initially this is the introduction before that book actually becomes published. Let me give you a little history. I've spent much of my life going to high schools, and I've never sat down to work out the figures, but I think that probably I may have spoken to millions of students. I certainly have spoken to at least 4,000 or 5,000 different high schools, and in most of those high schools I've spoken to all the different levels, from the early groups in the Australian culture of year 7 and 8, year 9 and 10, year 11 and 12. And of course, quite obviously, as a worker amongst young people, I've found that the issue of how you think about yourself, if you want to call that self-esteem, is very central at a certain stage in life, and probably there's no time when that is more significant than during the teenage years. So I became concerned about this whole issue of the way young people see themselves, and the way in which their view of themselves actually affects the way they live, affects their values, affects their relationships. And so I began to be interested in this subject, not necessarily under terms like self-esteem, but one way or another I became concerned about this in the very early years of working in high schools. Incidentally, I was a retired teacher who had academic qualifications to teach in both high school and also in primary school. So I had some wonderful years of teaching young kids that were in primary school, those lovely 10-year-olds, and then later on high school students. And in that field, mostly dealing with the humanities. And of course, the humanities are the subjects that look at the great issues of ethics and relationships and values. You don't do that so much if you're doing chemistry or physics or something like that. But they're very important areas, even if you're studying Shakespeare. In fact, I'm yet to do it, but one of the things I'm wanting to do is to take the story of Hamlet and look at the question of suicide and self-destruction, as was so extraordinarily dealt with in the story of Hamlet by William Shakespeare. But that's another story. But I became very concerned about the way in which young people were viewing themselves. By the end of the 1990s, as I was finishing off PhD work and studying particularly what's called cultural anthropology in America at the time, because social anthropology was the more English style of study and cultural anthropology was more American. In the midst of all this, I went for a speaking engagement in England at a festival called Greenbelt Festival. Now, Greenbelt was actually birthed out of what we call the Jesus movement. In actual fact, the kind of great music festivals and art festivals around the world owe much to their existence actually to a bunch of Jesus freaks back there at the end of the 1970s or even the beginning of the 1970s. And Greenbelt was a festival which began when a very creative hippie founder of a number of communes in the United States made a visit to England, caught up with an Oxford student who was interested in the youth culture, and they ended up starting a festival which at one stage had grown to an annual attendance of around 40,000 people. So it became a very large youth gathering, and I became one of the almost annual speakers at those festivals. Now, the festivals were mostly about the arts, and of course, if there's any field of human creativity and activity that is about who I am and how I look and how I feel, I mean, the arts are at the very core of that. So if one is to examine the pop music, I mean, where can you find a richer repository of ideas about what it is to be human, what the obligations of being human are? All of that stuff is so deeply embedded in the arts and well, in all of the arts, in the performing arts too, and in movies. In fact, you'd have to say that for many people, their view of history and their view of humanity is more shaped by movies than any history lesson that they have when they're at high school or at university. But anyway, I was going to these festivals year after year, and somewhere around the turn of the millennium, I think just prior to it, I spoke at Greenbelt Festival, and I was already really hot to trot over the question of self-esteem. Now, at that stage, it was becoming the darling of psychologists, and a lot of psychologists were becoming quite wealthy, I think, on meeting together with young people who were disturbed about their identity and relationships at home, and so on. So when I spoke at this rally, which was actually in a big, huge circus tent, and it would have been several thousand young people, it was quite a large crowd. I didn't only have a lot of young people, that was the main audience, but I had a lot of people who were youth workers and psychologists and others mixing with artists because they found this kind of festival a creative place to go and mix with young people and talk these issues through. Well, over the years, we had become in our ministry very involved in looking at depression. We'd spent a lot of time looking at the issue of suicide. And in fact, in our own country, there was a stage when my organisation probably was first off the rank when it came to newspaper reports on the latest government figures concerning suicide. There was a stage when Australia was claiming that it had the worst suicide rate for youth in the world, which was never actually true. A few countries like Finland were ahead of us, but we did have a very high suicide rate. And as I spent time working that through, I ended up in some real rigorous debate with some very good thinkers in this country. One of them was a man called Richard Eckersley, who had started off as a pure scientist with what was called the CSIRO, one of our Australian major organisations. Excuse me. Richard Eckersley was one of our major presenters who'd come out of the field of pure science in the CSIRO, a very famous Australian scientific corporation. And Eckersley had shifted into studying epidemiology. Taking his scientific skills, he began to ask why it was that in Australia, a land that had a reputation for the most easygoing lifestyle and good economies and all of that stuff, why would it be that we would have such a remarkably high rate of suicide amongst young people, and mainly amongst young men at the very end of their teenage years, but particularly in their early 20s. Now, Richard today has become quite a prominent analyst of culture, and he has written a great deal on material that I believe partly came out of the dialogue that was going on between a lot of us with Richard during those days, because we were convinced that the arguments that suicide had to do with poverty and socioeconomics made no sense. In fact, I remember talking to a gang leader from New York and from California, and he said, you know, on the streets, in the gangs, we kill one another, but in the burgs, the guys kill themselves with suicide. And that made me think, and as we began to look through that, I began to realise that the real sources of clinical depression, as distinct from what you might call biochemical depression, that clinical depression and suicide were not really about economics at all. And as we looked more and more into it, as we talked to thousands of kids in high schools, we became convinced that the two fundamental things that cause people in the youth sector to become hyper-depressed and ultimately suicide were the breakdown of relationships, and the other issue was the issue of worldview, of how you viewed yourself in terms of the whole cosmos, whether your life was of any real significance. So in one sense, it was relational and spiritual. And so we began to dig into that, and we argued a good deal with Richard Eckersley, and some of his more recent writings have really embraced this, where he said that two major things are causing depression amongst young people. One is the lack of moral frameworks and boundaries and values, and the other is the loss of community, the loss of a sense of connectedness to others. So radical individualism was actually a major force in bringing about depression and even suicide. Well, I was kind of well into that then a couple of decades before. Excuse me. Oh dear. I was well into this a couple of decades before the self-esteem myth had really taken root. So by the time I got up to speak at this conference, I felt rather informed. And so I spoke against the self-esteem movement rather boldly, even saying that the obsession with self would, number one, lead young people into clinical narcissism, that like Narcissus in the ancient mythology, sitting and looking at his own reflection in the pool and being unable to depart until he died of thirst and hunger because he was so obsessed with himself. Like this, we were going to increasingly see young people whose sense of mental health would deteriorate as they more and more turned into themselves. And the second thing I was saying was that, in the words of an old wit, I don't know if it was one of those American wits like Mark Twain, but someone said many years ago, a man wrapped up in himself makes a very small parcel. And the more you become obsessed with yourself, the less is the bigness of life. The less are visions of possibility as you become internalized. Anyway, the fascinating thing was that at the end of this presentation, I had two very, very emotional, almost packed responses. The first one was from a bunch of psychologists, some of whom would claim, like myself, to be Christian. But these psychologists were quite hostile towards me. And some of them even went so far as to say, do you realize what damage you've done to these young people? You have just stripped away their self-esteem, and they will be deeply depressed, and on they went. Well, I tried to explain to them where I was coming from, and it became very apparent that, of course, for them, what I was saying wasn't helpful for their bank balance, because feeding on the self-esteem myth was part of their clinical work they were doing with young people. Well, after I went through this queue of psychologists, then I ended up with a bunch of young people who had been patiently waiting while the experts were doing me over. And it was amazing because, without exception, the young people who came to talk to me, and some of them with tears in their eyes, were saying, oh, this is wonderful. You mean that I don't have to spend my life trying to find myself and search for myself? And I said, well, no, that's ridiculous. You are yourself. Find out what you can do with yourself. Find a vision for yourself. Get on with living life with yourself. But trying to find yourself is ridiculous. You are yourself. Anyway, they, one after another of these young people expressed their great relief that they didn't have to be self-obsessed. Now, the fascinating thing with that too was that one young man that came to me who'd been apparently disturbed for years and had been suicidal. His uncle was a prominent figure in the leadership of Greenbelt, and he came to me I think 3 days later as the Greenbelt Festival was ending, and he said, you will not believe what's happened with my nephew. He said, whatever you said at that meeting has caused him to find a new sense of liberty, a new sense that his life has somewhere to go, that there's value in his life. And he said, I just want to thank you for what a change that has made. Now, to backtrack, it's interesting to me that many of the figures who have had most influence in psychology, particularly concerning identity, are Jews. In fact, if you look at the group that was known, I think, as the Viennese School of Psychotherapy, it was basically made up of Jewish psychotherapists. And if I'm right here, I think it begins with Freud. And we have Freud, Jung, Adler, Maslow, and Frankl. Now that's fascinating because each one of those certainly touched on an area of identity. Who am I? Obviously Freud was obsessed with the whole sexual issue of identity. And there's no doubt that the intensity of the whole sexual drive in human beings and the interrelationship sexually between people is an important part of identity. But Jung, of course, gave us a sense that there was something far more esoteric and spiritual about identity, and so the business of interpreting dreams and finding spiritual roots to identity is much stronger in Jung than it was in many of the others. Adler, on the other hand, if I remember rightly, taught us that the peer group is very important. how we are viewed by our siblings and by our peer group has enormous effect on how we feel about ourselves. We are mirrored, if you like, by family, by siblings, and by our circle of friends. And if we don't get good messages back from those people, then it's very hard for us to feel good about ourselves. And of course, Maslow taught us that we have a hierarchy of needs. It's rather strange that just last night, when I wasn't sleeping too well, I was listening to the Australian Broadcasting Commission, and somebody rang in one of those kind of ring back circles for those late night programs, and started going on about Maslow and about the hierarchy of needs and where that fitted into our sense of self-esteem. Well, of course, the fascinating thing with that is that if you want to really study Maslow, you'll find that Maslow actually abandoned much of what he taught in early days. And when I wrote my book, which, as I said, will be out very soon, I discovered that that the way we are taught about Maslow, that the hierarchy of needs, of course, begins with the fundamentals of food and all those necessary basics to life. But Maslow, towards the end of his life, actually changed his tune. Because here's an interesting point. If somebody believes something, really believes something with all their heart, and they see it as fundamental to human existence, then such a person will sometimes go on a hunger strike and starve themselves to death because of their deep commitment to a belief system. So the hierarchy of needs doesn't begin and end with sexuality and physical issues. It actually finds its deepest roots not even in knowing who I am, but knowing who I am in the bigger picture of the universe. Who am I in terms of meaning? Is there any purpose lying behind the stars when I look at them at night? The psalmist long ago said, when I consider the heavens, the work of your hands, I say, what is man that thou art mindful of him? Or the son of man that you visit him? In other words, the psalmist was saying, when I even look at the cosmos, see the amazing stars out there, I find myself asking, in the face of that enormity and my minuscule presence in the midst of that gigantic cosmos, I find myself saying, what is life about? Where do I fit into that? And in fact, usually we say, more or less, what a worm is a human being. But in actual fact, that's not what he's saying. He's actually saying, at the end of the day, why would God visit the human creature if the human creature wasn't somehow of extraordinary significance? And if that's so of the human creature in general, then it's so of you and it's so of me. That our lives have a huge significance, that our artistic, creative abilities, our making of movies, our writing of songs, our heartfelt teasing out of the questions of the cosmos are an indication of extraordinary significance for each one of our lives. And if we can tap that and feel that, then the source of our sense of self-esteem is no longer inward looking at all. It's out there. It's much bigger than all that. Well, of course, moving on from Maslow, Frankl turns up. Now, Frankl, of course, ended up locked away in, I think it was Auschwitz, in one of the concentration camps. And his wife and he were separated through that incarceration. And he had put together, excuse me, sorry for this. Frankl had put together the substance of a book that was to become very famous, a book entitled Man's Search for Meaning. And other books too. He wrote one called The Unheard Cry for Meaning, which is a remarkable book that actually looks at sport and the significance of why in cultures where life is rather easygoing, why we get involved in the kinds of sports that push us to the limits physically and emotionally, why we do that. Anyway, Frankl was separated from his wife through incarceration. And while he was in prison, he noticed a strange thing. He noticed that there were many prisoners who were physically very weak, who shouldn't have survived, but because they had a strong sense of meaning, and although one couldn't put Frankl in some sort of Christian religious box, he had a sense of spirituality, and he saw this as so central to those that survived in prison. He said, you saw people that were fit and looked as though they could survive anything, and they would die despite their physical fitness, because there was despair, a lack of meaning, a lack of drive and purpose in their lives. And he said the two things that kept him fighting to continue to survive the rigours of that concentration camp were, first of all, he loved his wife, and he was determined to survive, to find out if she was alive. And the second thing was that he had written this manuscript, and he wanted to keep it alive in his head and revive it there in the prison cell, so that one day it could be published for the benefit of humankind. Now here's two interesting phrases that, if you're not an academic, might give you the willies, but just in passing. Maslow was saying we need self-actualization. In other words, we need that sense of actualizing, of making real who we are by that internal search. But what Frankl said was, no, we don't need self-actualization. We need self-transcendence. Unless we can find something bigger than ourselves to live for, we're not going to make it. And it's extraordinary that clinical depression and suicide is a mark of not those poverties that are poor, but those poverties that are overwhelmingly wealthy and have everything that, according to the hierarchy of needs, we should want. Free sex, lots of food, creative arts, all of that. I mean, just in passing, as one that loves the arts intensely and believes in their extraordinary spirituality and extraordinary importance in our culture, it amazes me that it seems to be in the artistic field that depression and suicide is so common. It happens so often. Well, dear old Frankl said, no, it's not self-actualization, it's self-transcendence that we need if we're to survive. Now, I think for this session, and I certainly, as the book comes out, will want to go through a number of other areas that are important. I do want to talk about the whole Jewish thing. Why is it the Jews have been so obsessed with psychotherapy to do with personal identity? We'll come to that later, because I think there are some very powerful answers to that. But I need to say this. In our current period in history, one of the most eminent psychologists has been Martin Seligman, who's done much work on the question of how to develop optimism in young people. He sees pessimism and optimism as not something that's biologically engendered, but it's a mind view, a world view we tend to develop when we're quite young. And it's a survival technique. And any of us have seen both, as it were, pessimists and optimists use that temperament to survive hard times. But the fact is, as I draw to the end of this, the fact is that people who survive are not the people who have life easy at all. And as one looks down through history, some of the most remarkable, resilient survivors have been those who, if it was about hierarchies of need, should have given up long ago. The fact is, Seligman has not bought the kind of self-esteem myth what Seligman has said is that if we seek to live our lives out in such a way that we expect to find fulfillment without performance, we end up in a very bad place. That our self-esteem is not something we find by looking for it, but the sense of goodness, the sense of life being worth living comes when you live a life worth living. And you can see that. And that's why in many cases the people who have some kind of spiritual foundation, whether it be a Gandhi, a Jesus Christ, a Martin Luther King, whether it be any of those kind of people, Mother Teresa, the people that seem through thick and thin to survive with a great, not arrogant sense of I am the greatest, but just a good sense that life is worth living, life is worth the battle, life is worth the price you pay, are those who see something much bigger than themselves to live for and to conclude. And this is really where we may go later in this series. But to conclude, let me say, Jesus got it right. He said, he that seeks to save his life will lose it. But he that loses his life for my sake and for the sake of spreading the good news, and that's such a huge story from Jesus, he or she will save it. And he also said, he that seeks to love his life will lose it. People lose that verse. He that seeks to love his life, or she that seeks to love her life, will lose it. So when it says, love your neighbour as yourself, it isn't saying, like some misguided preachers will tell you, go out and find love for yourself and then you'll be able to love others. Not at all. It really means that when you have that sense of overwhelming value of what a human life is, and a spiritual sense of that value, and you seek to love others, then in actual find love will blossom in your own heart, and the goodness of that will bring about a sense of wonder and delight at being a human being fully alive.